Come to this special hour devoted to today's supplementary budget. The finance minister laying bare the economic devastation, horror you can even say, caused by COVID-19. But he was saying that South Africa could emerge with a sustainable economy. It's all about debt though, if it rains in debt. The minister confirming expectations of substantial rises in debt levels. So my colleague Arabile Gumede joins us now to bring this to you in graphic form. I mean, Arabile, he's talking about South Africa spending beyond its means, and the hippo mouth is trending today.
Yeah, it certainly is, isn't it, Francis? Look, it's a big question as to how much can we get South Africa's yawning debt down to as little as possible. 87.4% is what government hopes to bring South Africa's debt down to as a portion of GDP by the year 2023-2024, that fiscal year. So it gets very interesting from this point. That if you say that you see debt to GDP going up to 81.8% for this fiscal year, how do you get it down in 3 years' time to kind of stabilize at that portion? Well, here's the trajectories. Let's get into the graphics and into the numbers in specific form right now then. Having sat currently at the 63.5% figure, that was already dangerous. We were already expecting the number to perhaps climb towards 70% or so, which isn't healthy for an emerging market economy like South Africa, as we continue to struggle to pay off our debt, and having recently been sent into non-investment grade by the final ratings agency, that's Moody's, giving us a full house of junk status ratings. It meant that South Africa borrowing, particularly from foreign investors, was bound to be very difficult. And now it will get even harder. As you can tell from the yellow dotted line going up to around 140.7% by the fiscal year 2029, that means that South Africa's debt as a portion of GDP will rise to 141 effectively percent by that point. And this may even be an optimistic example with regards to that figure, and that is a passive scenario. The passive scenario, according to National Treasury, means that they do as little as possible in alleviating that debt picture, or that the reforms that they institute aren't sufficient to bring down South Africa's debt. The problem is at present is that South Africa is making enough money to pay debt and not necessarily growth-enhancing measures, which is an absolutely big problem. When it comes to the active scenario, where South Africa continues to really implement a huge wave to try and bring down that debt picture, which is exactly what government is kind of looking at present, it means that we'll see that debt picture decline and even bring it to that 87.4% there by 2024. And that's the picture that government is currently painting, trying to be as optimistic as possible when it comes to the picture there. If we move on over to the next graph, then this is kind of where we sit when it comes to the unemployment number and the real GDP figure as well. So in the red, you have South Africa's unemployment number seemingly continuing to rise. Yesterday, we saw it hit 30.1%, and that was only for the first 3 months of the year, which rarely and really didn't take into account exactly what has happened with the COVID-19 pandemic and the scenario. But Q2 is bound to see that number spike even higher there. Real GDP going in the opposite direction, then falling off quite substantially there as things continue to proceed. So it does mean that we're headed in the opposite direction. That's where your sovereign debt crisis continues to worsen. All right, the very next one as well continues to tell you the story here. The real GDP growth figure, -2, well, we saw 2% growth, 0.2% should I say, in the 2019 fiscal year. And we thought at the very least that was horrendous already. But this year, we're now expecting to get -7.2% for 2020. It's going to get absolutely worse. But here's the positive part that National Treasury is trying to paint. A big pickup for that 2021 fiscal year, as we see the growth picture that's going to 2.6%. So a big jump there from that negative base of 7.2%. It's 1.5% averaging out in that 2022 and 2023 picture, painting out holistically an aggregate climb upwards, should we say, then for the medium-term framework. Inflation then for this year expected to average at 3%. We did see that figure come out as well earlier today around 10 a.m., where Stats SA said that inflation for the April figure, April month that is, did also come up at 3%, which is the lowest in nearly 15 years. The last time we saw it there was 2005. The month of June is when we saw it at 3%. So as people continue to get back into the economy, that inflation figure will continue to rise as an aggregate for each year as well. And very finally then as well, just what happens with expenditure and revenue. They continue to head in opposing directions. Not the picture we want. This is the actual picture of the hippo. As you can see, the yawning levels of South Africa's debt as expenditure goes higher, but revenue unfortunately going lower. And that's where your debt sovereign crisis continues to come into the picture. This has continued to be a worry for some time. And let's look at when this pretty much happened. The financial crisis, all right, of 2008, 2009 is when things got to this stage, but we haven't been able to arrest it. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has just made it look even worse. So that is perhaps some of the images that have been brought forth from this supplementary budget and really tells the picture of where South Africa sits right now. Let's discuss this a little bit further now. We are joined then by RMB Economist Mpho Molopyane, and she joins us now via Skype. Mpho, thank you so much for the time. Did that answer any questions for you? Did that give you any sort of assurance that we could arrest the debt crisis that we're in? Did the finance minister do anything exciting for you?
No, Aravile. I think this budget was always going to leave us with a lot of questions. I think the core purpose of this budget was to just outline where the 130 billion to partly fund the stimulus package, where that is going to come from. I think on the growth outlook, we already knew the dire situation that South Africa was going to find itself in. So that 7.2% contraction in GDP is more or less similar to what the South African Reserve Bank is also forecasting. But I think what's quite concerning is that ever-growing expenditure and tax revenue gap. And as you've already highlighted, that continues to influence our debt to GDP trajectory, which is very concerning. And the minister also highlighted that will lead us into a massive debt trap. But I think for me, what's quite worrying is that this budget also makes proposals around fiscal consolidation. So they talk about 230 billion in expenditure cuts for debt to GDP to be able to stabilize at much lower level. Now, the key question is, how is that going to be achieved? Where are those cuts going to be coming from? And remember that this 230 billion in expenditure cuts is in addition to the 160 billion in cuts for that will be coming from the public wage bill.
Yeah. At the same time, then you have plus minus 40 billion rand with regards to tax implications that are going to be brought forward over the next few years. It's not much in consideration of the current debt picture and trying to make up for the expenditure that we are going to be setting forward. But what are the changes that it could possibly make to the tax bracket or the tax scenario?
Yeah, the tax proposals as well are also quite worrying because if you just think about the structure of taxes, if more money is being taken away from consumers, so either in the form of personal income tax or in the form of VAT, that's actually money that could be contributing much more positively to growth. So an increase in the tax burden, I think that's going to be detrimental to growth. So it's going to weigh on that 2.6%, or is it the 2.9%? GDP that they're projecting for next year. But I guess what could be positive here is that what the minister mentions in the budget is that this could come from either improving tax compliance and also administrative efficiency, and most likely also introducing maybe new tax measures. So they talked about looking at in international taxes as well. We could also see other tax instruments as well being proposed where the burden does not necessarily have to lie on the consumer.
It seemingly puts the question out whether a wealth tax is certainly in play at this point, and I wouldn't bet against it at this point in time. If we talk very quickly then just, we've spoken about the debt trajectory, we've spoken about growth in particular as well, but one thing's for sure is that we needed some sort of surety that we are going in the right direction. As opposed to all the parables and the hippo, for example, we still haven't gotten the answers here. Is the fact that we're kicking it down the road mean that we're only delaying the inevitable? South Africa is going to go into a sovereign debt crisis. Is that perhaps something you're thinking about?
That's a very uncomfortable question, and I think unfortunately that's the question on top of everyone's mind. So remember, to avoid the debt trap, government makes this proposal that expenditure should be cut by 230 billion. So as I was saying, that for us to get there, what is it going to take? What is government going to cut? We still have the wage bill cuts, which were proposed in the February budget, are still hanging. The labor unions have said that they're going to be taking government to court. So I think it's a very uncomfortable situation. But for me, the active and passive scenarios which were painted, I think the passive scenario definitely has a much higher probability of panning out than the active scenario, because we tend to kick the can down the road. So like the minister told us that we have to wait for the medium-term budget statement where these measures are going to be enacted and outlined. But we still don't have any surety on the wage bill proposals as well. So how much further down the road are we going to kick this can?
Yeah, and just getting a zero-based budget isn't necessarily going to help, because that's a long way away, right? That's a very lengthy process.
It's a very lengthy process. So this is something that we looked into. I mean, implementing a zero-based budget is going to require a total overhaul of the current budgeting process. So firstly, government will have to set up a new budgeting framework. They'll then also have to train the budgeting analyst on how to draw up a zero-based budget. So there's huge implications for moving towards a zero-based budgeting process. There's also the cost of having systems implemented. So government is going to have to implement new systems, come up with new systems to make sure that they're able to then implement zero-based budgeting. And in addition to that, the key thing here is going to be when zero-based budgeting then says government needs to cut 200 or 300 billion, will National Treasury be able to implement that? Now, the question then becomes, if we know where the wastage is, why do we need a whole new budgeting process? Why can't we just carry on with the budgeting process as it is instead of incurring new costs when we implement zero-based budgeting? So we know where the wastage is. Let us already cut that wastage instead of looking at new solutions, which are not even going to help us in terms of cutting expenditure.
It gets harder
but
and
overall,
harder.
I think, yeah.
It certainly gets harder. Mpho, thank you so much. Really, really appreciated Economist there joining us then as we unpack the picture a little bit more when it comes to that supplementary budget, Mpho Molopyane then as well. So I hand over back to my colleague Francis Hurd. I'll be back a little bit later on to unravel and unpack things a little bit more when it comes to this budget. But do stay tuned to SABC News. We just head off to a short break.